welcome to day 6. We are at the midway point. Would you believe? I certainly can't quite believe. Will and I had a discussion this morning where I was like, I still feel like all of the last 6 days have been like one long extended first day, and that like I'm like, when's the festival like gonna begin? And then Will was like, I don't remember a time when Gŵyl hasn't been happening and when there hasn't been a festival on. So halfway point vibes. So today the first event is me. The first event is a book worth reading, an extended edition, where I talk through some books that don't feature at the festival but I think are really worth your time. They're all by women and they're all in translation, obviously. So that's the first app that came out today. Then secondly out today was Chinese children's literature with Helen Wang and Nikki Harman. I'm so happy to have that event. Helen Wang works like pretty much exclusively in children's Chinese literature, so she has like a wealth of expertise there. She's like the go-to person, and like when you Google like these Chinese children's books, like in English, they're all translated by Helen Wang. And then Nikki Harman has done some work I really admire with Yang Ge, and like just generally has done loads of advocacy work with Paper Republic, who you should check out if you're at all interested in Chinese literature. They are a huge resource for Chinese books in the UK and in other English-speaking countries, so that one's great. They're really fun. I particularly like when Helen shows a whole bunch of different children's books, and like we get a like glance at all the illustrations and all the sort of like picture books. That's great. Then we have Lawrence Schimmel talking to Iona McIntyre from the University of Edinburgh, and they're talking about La Bastarda, a book by Trifonia Maliba Obono, and that book is a little book that is just incredible. It's really, so it's a queer love story, coming of age story. It's in Equatorial Guinea, which is where Maliba is from. Trifonia Maliba is from, and it is well, it's just, I mean, it's not, you know, it's not an easy book, but it's also like, I devoured it. I just read it straight in one sitting, and Lawrence and Iona, so it's Iona, who you might recognise from an event last Friday, last Saturday, from our first day of the festival, who did translated The Adventures of China Iron, and so she's speaking to Lawrence because the book originally is translated from Spanish, so they talk a little bit about both the Spanish and the English language editions of the book. And that one's really worth a watch. It's absolutely fantastic and a fantastic book, and would recommend everybody gets that one as well. And if you haven't been to our festival bookshop yet, head over to Green Ink Booksellers. They have a bookshop.org page that is all of our books throughout the festival, and then they also, if you want anything else, they are a second-hand bookshop, and they are lovely, and they have a new team member. They've got a little baby who I think literally could be born any day now, so that's nice. So they need your extra support. And then last day we have a really profound, special, touching, emotional, meaningful talk about the poetry collection Sergius Seeks Bacchus, which is a queer Indonesian poetry collection by Norman Erickson Pasaribu and translated by Tiffany Sao, and these two were a delight to interview. So I got the opportunity to talk to them both. They have a really close bond and have worked together really, I think have found a friendship through working together, and they are also working on a short story collection that is coming out later this year with Tilted Access, and this poetry collection is just, I mean, you know, like on the tin it looks good, and on the inside it tastes phenomenal. I really love it. I just love it. I felt like it was such an honour to get to speak to them both, and to sort of see the emotions and wisdom that they have to share, and for their work. And you know, it's no mean feat what they're doing. It's no mean feat at all. And I'm just looking to see if there's anything I've missed to say about it. Oh yeah, on the name, I knew there was something else. So on the name, on the event, I've called it Queer Indonesian Love Letters. Because that is what Norman refers to it as, and he sees all these poems as essentially love letters to his boyfriend, and they're kind of, you know, I think what I admire most about Norman is that he, not most, I admire quite a lot about Norman, but one of the many things I find impressive is that he keeps this sense of fun as much as he possibly can, and of playing and of being a bit naughty. And I love the idea that in his head these poems are really love letters to his boyfriend at their heart. So yeah, I think, like, if you do one thing from the festival, please go buy Sergius Meeks Bacchus, and please order at least 10 copies of their short stories coming out this November. Like, that would mean everything to them. So yeah, so those are our events for today. So quickly, before we head into those highlights, check out that festival bookshop. If you haven't seen Eleanor Cowell's work on De Writer's Place, so if you remember, De Writer's Place is by Barbara Jenkins, and we did a talk about Trinidad's linguistic history a few days ago, and what happens in her book De Writer's Place, there's a mural. And so when Eleanor and I were like discussing what art should be made, I was like, Eleanor, there's this mural. I really like, this would be really, really cool. So she has drawn it based on how it reads and on how she imagines it coming to life. And it's incredible. I am like, yeah, Eleanor's art is always phenomenal, and this is just amazing. So would highly recommend you go have a little look at that if you haven't had a chance. Linked down below to see that, by De Writer's Place as well. And then last but not least, a free playlist. There's lots of music throughout the festival. Check out some of the, but like other than the sets that are on YouTube, there is also a playlist on Spotify that Will Dawson and Chope put together, and it's great. It's just really, really good. It's just like a fully like enjoyable, like, it's I made sure to like be ready with my descriptions. Afro beats, Ethiopian jazz, Sicilian folk, and what was the last one? Oh, come on, Caitlin. What was the last one? Ethiopian jazz, Afro beats, Sicilian folk, and Pakistani soul, and much more. Go check out that playlist and enjoy these highlights. Here we go. We have me, if you haven't seen enough of me. We have Nikki Harmon and Helen Wang, Chinese children's literature. We have Lawrence Schimmel and Iona McIntyre talking about La Bastarda by Trifonia Maliba Obono. And then last but not least, we have Norman Erickson Passaribu and Tiffany Zhao on Sergius Meeks Bacchus. All the best, and have a lovely evening. So the first one I want to pull on is this book by, I'll put a little image down below or something so you can see it. I know it's a little bit dark, but it's called Wondrous Journeys in Strange Lands by Sonia Nim, translated by Marsha Lynx Quayle. And it's a episodic book. It's a bit like sort of in the tradition of like a myths and legends. So she's a Palestinian writer, and her character starts off in Palestine, and then each sort of chapter makes her way to Egypt, to India, and back to Palestine. Like she does this like journey, a bit like, it's probably a hero's quest thing, isn't it, really? And it's slightly absurd, you know, so like in the way that like sort of myths and legends can be, none of these things could have really happened to one person in their whole life. They're larger than life. It's a really special book, and it's written for children, but like with all children's books, more or less, there is a huge amount to be gained by an adult reading them, and this book's really special. And I think Sonia Nimr is a really special writer as well. She's written quite a lot of books. There's one called Gadar and the Gŵyl. The Ghouls. There is sort of folk tales from Palestine as well. So that's my very strong recommendation. It's a little bit hard to get hold of, but very much worth the effort.
One of the things that I find difficult is I find names really difficult, personal names very difficult, and place names. Because in Chinese, there'll often be there'll be a meaning behind the name. So for example, sort of Nikki, Helen, Caitlin, we have the names that we're given, but and we may know what they mean, but they're fairly regular kind of names. Whereas in Chinese, you can create any names you like, and sometimes there will be a sound to them, sound element. Sometimes there will be a visual element in the characters, and sometimes in the story there will be lots of interlinking, and there'll be codes within the story that are linked in the names. So I'm translating a story at the moment where the names are absolutely essential, and I have no idea how I'm going to do it in English, because it works in Chinese, but I don't know how it's going to work in English at the moment, because there are lots of puns and there are lots of twists and turns, and I suspect that there may be a case of I get the joke too soon because I'm thinking of the name phonetically, and the reader might read it and see it visually and may not sound it out, and if they don't sound it out, they may not get it. So I'm toying with all of these different things at the moment. So those things I find quite tricky. They're also, it's a little bit like doing cryptic crosswords. If you get it, it works and you feel good about it. And if you don't get it, it just gets under your skin until eventually either you do something about it or you leave it. Nikki.
Well, yes, I mean, Daisy, we could go on forever with examples like that. I think I'll make a kind of, I totally agree about names. Names, especially authors that give their characters names that they've given them with intent, that the intent is to suggest to the reader that that person is a certain type of person, and so on. It's so difficult to deal with, but besides, there's a whole tradition that says you mustn't translate names, but actually then if you don't, especially nicknames, then you lose that whole layer of meaning. And Chinese is not the only language. I often see translators forums where people translating from Spanish to English or any other language are talking about the same problems. But I think the broader comment that I'd like to make is that the languages are so different, and the key to a good translation is to get absolutely as much in there as you possibly can, but then give yourself a bit of time, read it again, and try to spot the skeleton of the Chinese syntax. Take it out. We don't want any skeletons. We don't want a reader who knows Chinese to read it and say, oh, I know what the Chinese said because that's the way the English has come out. And my goodness, it sounds awkward in English. So somehow you've got to be very faithful to the content, but you've also got to produce something in English that reads fluently in English, and particularly for young readers. Well, for all readers, I think. And dialogue, the mark of a serious translator is someone who can really deal with dialogue. Dialogue has got to sound like someone's actually spoken it. I mean, unless the Chinese protagonist is actually giving a speech, in which case the English translation will sound like they're giving a speech. Mostly, you've got to look very carefully at dialogue. You've got to make it sound like dialogue. If you've used words in your translation that don't sound like anyone would ever say them, then your character doesn't sound convincing anymore. And the reader's going to be turned right off, no matter what age they are.
I'm going to disagree with one aspect of what Nikki has just said, is that, yes, it must read well at the end. and it must read, it must read genuinely. But when it comes to translating and removing the skeleton of the Chinese, I don't always agree with that, because to me, sometimes what I try to do is, if I can, I try to get as close as I possibly can to the Chinese without, not being stilted, but because sometimes there are things that are expressed in the Chinese way that actually are just perfect, and there isn't an exact English equivalent. There's maybe one that's similar-ish, with a similar kind of intent and a similar kind of meaning, but the way it's expressed and the way it's described is just, it's kind of like magic, and if you can get that, then it really works. And it doesn't always work, and if it doesn't work, then that's the worst thing. That just makes it absolutely dreadful, and yes, you should remove it. But if you can make it work, actually you're bringing something really from another language into English, and you're really kind of creating something that's new in English. It's not new in Chinese, but it's new in English, and if it works, it's brilliant. It's really hard to do that, but it's a genuine pleasure when it's possible.
So she, Trifonia Melibea Bono, is the first woman writer to be published in English who comes from Equatorial Guinea. And I also wanted to just read out a tiny wee snip of a review. So, writing in the Johannesburg Review of Books, Euphemia Chela described La Bastarda as a revolutionary piece of literature where a young girl isn't saved by her long-lost father, but by herself. And I think one of the first things that I kind of wanted to ask you about is it's so strong, the title, like it really packs a punch. And I wondered, can you remember much about that period when you had that kind of going around in your head and you had to take some decisions about how you wanted to approach all this and what you would want the title to be? Can you remember the kind of processes and thoughts you had?
Yeah, and I mean, we had a lot of discussion about it. I, for instance, was not in favor of keeping the article in Spanish. I thought that calling it the Bastarda would make it easier for, I mean, especially within the US, for booksellers not to be confused that it wasn't the original Spanish language version of the book.
Good point.
So by calling the Bastarda, also the very last line of the book, which is the most poetic line in the book, it's the most powerful line in the book, it's and which uses the word bastarda, was so difficult.
Very strong statement of identity, very strong.
Exactly. And so that had, I mean, that line probably took more time than the entire rest of the book. So I was fortunate. I won a place at the Banff International Literary Translation Conference, which is held in June each year. So I translated much of the book in Banff in a community of other translators, and it was interesting because we each presented the project we're working on, and one of the other translators said, "Well, what about the style?" And I was like, "There really isn't a style. I mean, aside from that one last line, there's not a metaphor used throughout the entire novel. It's on one level, it's a very simple language. It's a very oral language. One of the things that we, negotiating with my editor, I said, so, I mean, we haven't talked much about Equatorial Guinea yet. So Equatorial Guinea is a former Spanish colony. It's the only African country as a country where the national language is still, Spanish is one of the national languages. It's a dictatorship. There's no publishing in the country at all. So all writers are writing, if they're published, they're publishing abroad. So they know that they're writing for a foreign audience, which is something that happens. But one of the peculiarities, I think, is that the texture of the language still feels somewhat antiquated. It still sounds, or it often sounds like like the period when it stopped being a colony, that it hasn't caught up in terms of, for instance, modern Iberian slang. There isn't a lot of that in the works written by writers in Equatorial Guinea. There is their own slang, but there's not, it still has a sort of antiquated feel. So one of the things that we decided in the translation, to the protagonist of the novel, Okoma, is a 16-year-old girl. And I said, we don't want her to sound like a valley girl from California. You know what I'm saying? So we purposefully made sure the copy editor didn't revert all of the times that instead of, I don't use possessives. So it's always the something of something instead of, it gives it that slightly antiquated feel without being noticeable necessarily. But, I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't full of like, or, the possessives, I think, made it sound too modern. And so that was something that we did on a language level to keep the language. Another thing is that, so the novel's written in Spanish, but does have a number of Fang words in it, which in the Spanish edition are all explained with a glossary at the end. And so talking with my editor, we weren't in favor of, footnoting or glossaries. And so we glossed all of those words. We kept the Fang in the original, in English, and we glossed what they mean the first time that any of the words is used. But I didn't want people to think that I translated from the Fang and that we were just leaving for texture some Fang words. So I argued that we left some words in Spanish to keep that multilingual texture.
If I trace back to the times when I wrote Sergius Mencari Bakus, the initial idea is like to kind of like being naughty to the current like the contemporary poetry in Indonesia, because it's quite, I feel it's very heteronormative. So I kind of like just try to be naughty to that kind of like, how to say, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if anyone reads Indonesian poetry, like the contemporary or even the classics, you can say how I tried so hard to be naughty. So that's the initial idea, and it's also like it's a book for my boyfriend, so it's kind of like love letters, I guess, in a way, because like I don't know, yeah, maybe that's how it initially began. And then because like I need to say this right, because like so none of the poems in the book ever published in Indonesian journals, and then I sent it to a competition by Jakarta Art Council, and it won first prize. And then it all started from there. Before this book, I've written another book, a book of short stories. I actually write anything, but then it's easier to get published as a fiction writer than a poet here. So that's how. But I mostly read poetry, and then I start writing poetry rather than fiction in my younger age.
What do you what makes you pick between each form? Like, what will make you think that like an idea, oh, this feels like a short story or a poem?
Oh, that like why I choose it to be narrative, for example, because like how to say, it's mostly how I respond to like my own life, basically. So for example, the poem Curriculum Vitae, it's like actually my alter ego, but written in the third person. So it's kind of like in Indonesia, there is a very strong sense that people talk about you, because like it's very communitarian here. It's like it's very communal, like everyone knows everyone talks about everyone. So in this space, sometimes being queer is very hard, because like you are different from the, how to say, what people consider as like normal, what people think as like right. So even like, so it kind of like I want to receive, so this situation kind of like make like a second image of me, which is often untrue and kind of like made up from gossip. So it's kind of like I want to gossip about myself to make myself a second image that is like very different from what people thought about me. So it's kind of like how I just respond to my surrounding. I don't know why. When I reread the book, I kind of like think the stories in this book kind of like revolve around the idea of broken teeth. So if you, I just like when I read the book, it has so many bad teeth. I don't know why. And it's kind of like maybe uh how like there is a story about a woman whose son uh suicide. So it's really hard for me to write. But then I kind of like think that's how how to say, like how heteronormative people are here without queer people. They are broken teeth. They are kind of like rotting away. So it's kind of like maybe kind of like um the idea of being like what if we are absent in their lives, what's gonna happen, something like that. And it's kind of like playful in other ways. Like some of them are like fantasy and then sci-fi, and then there is a fictional history like short story. So it's kind of like my editor in Indonesian asked me, I like this one, is this real? No, it's a fictional history. So it kind of like it's kind of like just making challenging what is like considered real for us. Like yeah, like the idea of broken teeth is itself, it's about our world destabilized and then rotting away. And then I kind of like how to say town Indonesians by titling it happy stories. It's like so many people like, oh my god, none of these are happy. Well, because like we have Disneyfied version of happiness, so nothing is happy unless it's as if like nothing is sweet unless it's like super sweet. So even though like in real lives we have maybe rarely get super sweet moments, so it's kind of like everything is just bittersweet. So it's kind of like I'm also taunting people to like reconsider what they thought as happy, for example.
Oh,
Like because being happy is like it's very much linked to our own privilege. So how do you expect, for example, queer people to be happy in a place where they are hated? And then I know we can, for example, make so much, how to say, possible idea of being happy, but then when we have Disneyfied version of happy, it's a bit hard to imagine those possible. Yeah, with yeah, I think yeah.